much, Liam. So I'm Ruairi, and I'll be presenting today on my final year dissertation, which is entitled "A Place of Many Incarnations: Space, Place, and Institutions at Glencree, County Wicklow, 1830 to 1930." So I suppose a little bit of background to this research. This research is being undertaken as part of my final year dissertation at UCD, and this is still ongoing research. I'm due to submit at the end of April 2021. I'm being supervised by Dr. Catherine Cox at the UC School of History, and she's been very useful for the progress of this research. So I suppose, why Glencree? So Glencree is a valley in County Wicklow, and I spent a lot of my time before restrictions in that part of Wicklow doing various things, hiking and running, those kind of things. And also in a previous module I'd come across Glencree before. And Glencree is a valley like many other valleys in County Wicklow, but it has a very unusual history and has a very unusual institutional history, especially. And of course, institutional history right now, it's really topical in Ireland, like the recent release of the Mother and Baby Homes reports. I think institutional history in Ireland has become very much a modern and contemporary issue, much more so than a lot of other, perhaps, aspects of that period of the time. So what am I focusing on in this dissertation? So I'm focusing on place and space in history. So when we think about place in history, it plays a really vital role. So history always takes place somewhere. So you think about these places like Waterloo, Versailles, or Normandy. You think about huge eras, epochs of history, and these places that invoke, major parts of history. And often some places can be actually timeless, and they can bridge between different periods and different epochs of history quite seamlessly. So I'm going to use Glencree in County Wicklow as a case study of place in history. And I'm especially going to have to examine how a collection of buildings in Glencree saw continuous changes in purpose and occupation throughout the 100-year period that I'm dealing with. So Glencree, of course, is an isolated mountainous valley in County Wicklow, and it's located about 12 kilometres from Dublin. But despite this close physical proximity, the valley is very wild and sparsely populated. And prolific Irish writer James Synge described Glencree as a place of loneliness that had no equal in one of his descriptive travel books. And he'd been around quite a lot of different rural parts of Ireland, but even a mere 12 kilometres from Dublin, you can find loneliness that has no equal. But I think it's also important for me to say that my research is focusing specifically on a collection of buildings in the valley of Glencree. I'm just going to go to this next picture. So this is a picture of the buildings in question. They're at the very head of the valley in Glencree. And I'm not really looking at the rest of the valley, which includes places like the village of Enniskerry and Powerscourt Estate. So I think this picture is really important. So this picture is taken by William Lawrence. It's taken circa 1880 to 1900. And what's important thing about this photo is really very little has changed since when this photo was taken and if you went there today. We see a very classic Irish landscape in the background. We see a barren rural mountain, very little growth. And actually the road you can see in the background there as well is still there. It's the exact same road layout. And then in the foreground, of course, we see this juxtaposition between this very wild, barren landscape and this collection of buildings that just seem very much out of place. And so these are the buildings I'll be focusing my research on. And the building on the right-hand side of the photo there, the kind of white prominent building, this is Glencree Barracks. This is the original building that was built in the location. And this is the first institution that my dissertation focuses on. In fact, this photo you're seeing now is actually taken of the second institution that I'm going to look at, which is St. Kevin's Reformatory School. And in that institution, they added some of the other outbuildings you can see, including the chapel on the right-hand side. But as I want to repeat again, although this is very, very closely located to Dublin, outside of this specific collection of buildings, there's really very little going on in this valley. It's a beautiful valley. I really highly recommend you go and get a chance when restrictions lift and go for a cycle or go for a drive. But what's really important to think about is this is just such a rare and unique collection of activity in such a rural valley. So I want to give a short kind of timeline, I suppose, of Glencree in the 19th century. Sorry, the timeline is off scale. But in 1806, we have the opening of the first institution at this site, which is Glencree Barracks. And it's built as part of the garrison of the Wicklow Military Road. So the Wicklow Military Road was constructed mainly in the fear of the rebels they'd taken shelter in the Wicklow Mountains. And this is mostly during the Napoleonic War period. So there was a worry in Dublin Castle that these rebels would join forces with French forces in an attempt to invade or overtake Ireland. And the barracks was designed as part of a network of barracks along the military road to house 100 soldiers and a captain. But what's very interesting about the barracks is it's very short-lived because the Napoleonic Wars come to a conclusion. And we see that it falls into disrepair in the latter half of the 19th century. And very interestingly, rather than just leaving this barracks as a ruin, as some of the other barracks in the Wicklow Military Road have become, instead, this barracks goes on to become a whole different institution in the form of St. Kevin's Reformatory School. So the Oblates of Mary Immaculate take over the site of the barracks in 1858, and they work over the winter of 1858 to transform it into a suitable place for a reformatory school. And this work is extremely expensive. It's extremely difficult. As you can imagine, a barracks would fall into disrepair in a very rural part of Wicklow. It's very difficult to properly construct it. And over a winter, they do their best, and they eventually, in 1859, are open for their first inmates. And St. Kevin's Reformatory School is then open until 1940. And at this point, all the staff and boys are moved to a facility in County Offaly. In the next couple of slides, I will go into detail about what these various institutions actually are. But I think what's important is to see this really quite short time frame wherein we have a variety of institutions in this one particular location. So I wanted to use this map. This map is from the Army Barracks of 18th Century Ireland project to kind of illustrate where Glencree is in context to Dublin. So this map is really useful because we see the barracks of 18th century Ireland that were constructed, and especially the network of them that were within Dublin itself. And there was quite a few in central Dublin, one in Howth, one in Bray, one in Naas. But then kind of in the very southern part of the map there, you see a red dot, and that dot is Glencree, and it's really, you might say, quite randomly located. They could have chosen anywhere really in that network or in that area of North Wicklow to construct a barracks, but they chose there. And that's really significant that they chose this very particular valley to construct this barracks, yet so close to Dublin. So they were still worried about rebel activity within such a close proximity to Dublin. And this is the early 1800s. You know, this is not what you might say the days before the Pale. This is firmly when Ireland was a colony, and even this is after the Act of Union. And this Army Barracks of 18th Century Ireland project has been really interesting and useful for my research, and it was compiled by Dr. Ivan McGrath of the UC School of History, and it's an ongoing project as well. So there's a lot of different research in the same area going on simultaneously. So the first institution then is Glencree Barracks, and as mentioned, it's built as part of the Wicklow Military Road, which is a road in County Wicklow that you can still drive today, and it's very popular for cycling. And as I mentioned, it's designed to house quite a small garrison, 100 soldiers and a captain. And even though in that picture we looked at earlier, it's quite an imposing building to house such a small garrison. And as I mentioned before, it's a short-lived institution due to the end of the Napoleonic Wars. This image on the right, I hope you can see it. This is a pencil sketch. It's quite light and it's a little bit difficult to see, but I think you can make out the building of Glencree Barracks there on the right-hand side of the photo. But what's also important to see is the rest of the landscape in the valley. And this landscape you're seeing really will not have changed. If you stood on the road or at the location that Georges Victor Dunoyer, the artist, he stood, you would see a lot of the same things. You would see in the far left-hand side there, we see the Sugarloaf and we see the mountains of Jouse and Mullen on the right. And the landscape is really similar. So really the place has changed very little. But yet, despite this kind of lack of change, this stagnation of the rest of the valley, we have this one institution that's just so different and so unique. And I guess that's what really drew me into this research. So then the second institution is St. Kevin's Reformatory School. And St. Kevin's Reformatory School is a really, really fascinating institution. So I guess I should say what a reformatory school is. So a reformatory school is, putting it very colloquially, it's a prison for children. So the idea is it's somewhere to house delinquent children and to rehabilitate them and to reintroduce them to society after their period there. So before the introduction of the reformatory school system, children in Ireland were actually sent to regular jail. And it was realised very early in the 1800s that this was just very destructive, and that they needed to do something particularly for these destitute children. And so this is where the idea of this reformatory school network came from. And so St. Kevin's was actually the first reformatory school in Ireland, which is again very unique for this very isolated valley in Wicklow. And we see this very incredible transformation from a dilapidated barracks into a pioneering and remarkable institution for isolated and rural County Wicklow. And the reformatory school network is based on development of reformatory type discipline in Ireland, but also in Europe, and a whole change and shift in the way people saw disciplinary institutions in general. And they saw that disciplinary institutions were not merely made to punish, but also to rehabilitate and reform. So reformatory schools focus a lot more on what happens at the school. So we're looking less at walls, less at these kind of traditional architectures of prisons and of disciplinary institutions, and much more at the constructive work that the children undertook at St. Kevin's. Of course, the struggle in any research in Irish institutional history is to not be distracted too much by official reports. The Lord Mayor of Dublin in 1888, on an annual municipal visit, he declared St. Kevin's as the most successful social experiment of modern times. Of course, this is a very distracting idea because we don't see what the reality is like in day-to-day life for the children at St. Kevin's. And in fact, the death of a child on the way to St. Kevin's from Belfast Jail really illustrates that the location in rural County Wicklow was perhaps a short-sighted one. And especially the climate conditions in this kind of wild valley would have been very difficult for young, often malnourished children. So I want to think a little bit about my methodology for this research. So I've leaned very heavily on secondary literature, and there's really very little particular secondary literature on Glencree itself, but a lot of literature kind of deals with maybe the general history of Wicklow, so they've been very helpful. Michael Feuer's book there, The Wicklow Military Road, he has the only piece of secondary literature I could find that particularly dealt with Glencree itself, and he also notes that there's quite a lot going on in this very particular location. What I really appreciated was in Arthur Flynn's History of County Wicklow, and this is where I got my title quote, "A Place of Many Incarnations." And it's a really nice and succinct way of thinking of what Glencree is really about, which is one place with such a variety of incarnations, as Arthur Flynn has said. And then when we're thinking about place history in general, we need to look at some theoretical research, and books like this one, Empty Spaces, which is by Courtney J. Campbell, Allegra Givian, and UCD's Jennifer Keating, have been very useful for this.
Sorry, Kevin, I wanted to get some questions in here because really
sure,
interested here. Just your conclusions now, because
sure.
I want to leave some time now.
I have also used some of the primary material, including the reports of the inspectors to reformatory schools, and this has been really interesting, and these are fully digitalized primary material. So to think about the conclusions, I have focused on the transitional period of the first two institutions at Glencree, but in this research, I've left aside the 20th century history of Glencree, and there's a lot going on in that period as well. And I've actually realized that Glencree deserves a lot more research than it's gotten. It's used to house displaced Austrian German children and becomes the location of the only war cemetery in Ireland. So I think Glencree is really interesting because it offers insight into what we can do as humans. We can make something unique of a situation that really should be far from unique. So thank you very much for listening.
Brilliant, excellent. Can I invite any questions here before I try to jump in with mine now? I'm very conscious of the time, so please jump in if you have a question. 5 seconds. Ruairi, if I can jump in, within history and historical research now, space and place, is this now becoming a major theme within historical research?
It's a good question. I think that it's often been an underlying theme to historical research in general, you know. It's perhaps not the most invigorating or kind of maybe even interesting research, because I think people are much more interested about what happens in those places. But it's always in the background, you know, like where things happen, and especially as I've named these, we can really connect history to places in general. So I think it's really, really important to think about it as an important part of historical research for sure.
Absolutely. Fascinating stuff. Ruairi, thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. And I can